My guest today explains why the most important conflict in the world today is also the one that nobody is paying attention to.
This is Jay Martin.
Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the great minds of geopolitics and finance so that we can understand the world better. My guest today is David Murrin, global forecaster, investor, and author. We spend today's conversation dissecting the historic patterns and cycles in wealth, war, and power, and then debating where we may land within that cycle today. I think David's answer to that question is going to surprise you. At the end of this interview, he shares the impact this cycle will have on the oil, gold, silver, and Bitcoin market. Make sure to stick around for the end. Here's my interview with David Murrin. Enjoy. David, thanks for joining me. I'm excited to chat with you again today. I appreciate your time.
Jay, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on your show.
Okay, so to start off, I want to understand your framework for processing the world. You've got some unique models that help you understand cycles of war and power and commodity influence. And so using that as a jump off period, I've got a handful of strings I'm expecting I'm going to pull on. One that I'm very excited to talk to you about, we're looking at the plethora of global conflicts around the world, and I'm beginning to think that the most important is also the one that's getting the least attention. And this is what I'm beginning to call just the battle for Africa, right? 9 governments overthrown in the last 3 years. Lots to dive into there, but I want to begin with your framework for understanding war, power, and commodity cycles, and then we'll jump in.
Okay, so I'm a physicist by training. And when I joined in JP Morgan in 86, I quickly believed that price behavior was a collective endeavor and that price and emotions corresponded. And somewhere in that observation was a code to break and predict markets. And that's exactly what I did as one of the first prop traders and setting up an organization that changed the way the bank was able to anticipate market moves and take risk. That led me to run one of the first hedge funds in Europe, an emerging market hedge fund and a macro hedge fund. And all that seemed rather financial until 9/11 came along. And after 9/11, or as 9/11 happened, I found myself asking the question, what if it isn't an accident? What if it isn't just a pimple on this perception that democracy was going to last a century, but it was more significant? How could I look at where our systems were in the Western world and outside it and evaluate exactly what was happening? The problem is there isn't enough price data to do that. And so what I did was took a fractal of a price behavior, in effect, and an emotional behavior, and I expanded it to a much larger degree, which I call the 5 stages of empire model. Regionalization, expansion to empire, maturity, overextension and decline. And we're talking in 2002 when this really wasn't even a topic of debate. And I created this whole model called the 5 stages of empire model that was driven by the expansion of populations and essentially contracted. And I didn't have price data, but what I did have is wars as the clocks of empires. So building this model, because each type of war is very distinctive as the cycle expands and contracts. So wars allowed me to basically look at every civilization I could find, from the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans to our modern civilizations. They all did similar things and for similar times, and they were marked by conflicts as they followed their curves. Now, there's an awful lot more to that, in terms of the financial dynamics of how they borrow money initially, or they have a civil war between regionalization and expansion. And that civil war is essentially a social engineering program to lateralize society, because lateralization is adaptive. And the consequence of all human wars, as we'll come on to, is adaptation and lateralization. Otherwise, you lose. But that lateralized system that's now militarized runs up its resource chains, builds an empire exponentially if there is a vacuum to move into or a weak system to challenge, and then goes through a maturity cycle, at which stage a more linear mindset starts to remove the lateral creators because everything is under control and more stable. And the result is, over time, the system linearizes, becomes non-productive, non-competitive, borrows money to create leverage to compensate for lack of production, and collapses. Now, that was a pretty on the edge when you're talking, and I went on CNBC and talked about that concept in 2002 and 2003. And I'd also gone a little bit further because when I looked at the Western empires, something was very different. Instead of being 300 years average or to 350 years, they were actually much shorter. And so something was happening between the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the British, the Germans, the Americans, very different. And I concluded that they were the pistons of a much bigger engine. Instead of a nationalistic empire, it was a mimic empire defined by the values of Western Christianity. Initially, it was Catholic, and the Protestant Revolution went with the Sea Power Revolution and went with the democratization process at the same time. And the modern world was born in the form of the British Empire, which spread around the world. So it started to explain a lot of how we got to where we got to. And really, the First World War was the civil war, as it was between Germany and Britain, of this Western Christian super empire. And from the First War onwards, we were in trouble because the Second World War was just part two of part one. And America was essentially not the beginning of this end of history clause, but America was the last of the Western Christian empires. So if it went into decline, the whole system was going to go into decline with it. And I highlighted that after 9/11, America had gone into decline. And sure enough, 22 years later, I think no one would disagree with that analysis. But at the time, it was entirely prophetic, not only because it called the direction, but also because essentially it called how that direction would unfold, like uncontrollable debt dynamics and something else, which is really key. Nature abhors a vacuum. And throughout history, you can think of the empires as the piston of human evolution. And so what was going to fill the vacuum of Western Christian decline? And in that, I was able to answer the Super Asian Empire, which had started with Japan in its modern form, and China was 100 years into its evolution, and I could track China's curve, and China was going to expand and take on America and the West. Now, when I talked about that in 2003, people used to fall off their chairs because all they saw China as at that stage was a copy, an imitation mechanism of the West. But they did something completely different. They seduced the West to invest in their manufacturing base, to deindustrialize themselves, and they knew that they could use that industrial base to have an arms race that would swamp the West. In effect, the West was seduced to pay for its own demise. And I warned against that because I'd studied Chinese martial arts for a long time and Sun Tzu. But all we could see in the West was cheaper manufacturing, lower imported inflation, and greed everywhere. Whether it's the politicians or whether it was Wall Street, they all suffered from our own greed, which essentially has undermined us, much to the humor of the CCP, who intentionally duped us. Now, the big question is when you have a hegemon that's in decline and a hegemon that's now rising, there is a moment and never a peaceful transition when a conflict arises. And bring in the second external theory, which was as a follower of Kondratiev, he had made an observation that wars happen in 56-year cycles along with inflation and resource constriction. And I was a follower of Kondratiev, which let me get into the commodity cycle from '01 onwards and make a huge amount of money for our funds. But I also knew if that commodity cycle was real, then a conflict was real, starting somewhere into the next peak, which was due to be 2030. And so from the moment I started to study these concepts, I feared that we would have World War III years before that peak, which I highlighted in my book would be 2022. Because the friction that comes with resource competition and something which I'll explain to you in a minute about what's really going on here, but means that conflict breaks out way before these Kondratiev peaks. And to highlight it, and it took me up until about 4 years ago, I was really observing behavior, but I didn't really understand why we behaved as a collective human species this way. And being a physicist, always trying to condense things into the most essential principles is something that you're driven by. So what was driving humanity to behave the way it did? And I started to think about a theory which was based around the environment we sat in. And for all of you that haven't heard this, the universe is entropic. It goes from order to disorder over time. You know that your matchboxes, when they put the matches back in the box, so the film's been reversed. You know that entropy is the matches jumping out of the box when you drop it and creating chaos. So we as living creatures live in a chaotic universe. And we counter that by what I call anti-entropy, trying to create order around us, whether it's a campfire, a shelter, whether it's an early village, or a city, a community, an empire with multiple food sources. That's our answer to this intrepid universe. Social coordination, which we see in the form of empire cycles, which takes us to the point of greater levels of control of our environment and survivability. So this concept of anti-entropy. But what's really interesting is anti-entropy is its best format with lateralization. So if you take a human society and you left it in peace and you left it in stability, it would naturally become more linear. And then when a big shock came along, it would just get wiped out. And we have a duality in our human species, I believe, and the evidence is very strong. There's 70% of people have agrarian genetic backgrounds which are linear, and 30% have hunter-gatherer backgrounds which are lateral and adaptive. And the warrior gene sits in the 30%, not in the 70. The adaptive gene sits in the 30%, not in the 70. The 70 is about iteration and process and repeatability. So we have two mindsets that sit within the human civilization, and they do not understand or relate to each other. They fight for power, in effect, unconsciously, because the mindsets are so different. And the result that war brings is forced lateralization. So our evolutionary cycle is dictated by this Kondratiev drumbeat, which is more than an inflationary or constriction cycle. I think it's a pulse of entropy that somehow surges through human civilization. And every 56 years, you end up with a war. But every 112 years, historically, we end up with a major war, a hegemonic conflict, which you can date back to the Franco-Spanish Wars. You can date it back to the Napoleonic Wars, which started in 1798, when the peak of that Kondratiev cycle was 1808. The First World War was started in 1914, when the peak of that cycle was 1920. And our cycle is already into conflict, but we don't identify it, which is the 2022 invasion of Russia. And all that's followed is all part of it. So, and at its heart, we face two constructs which superimpose this, which is humanity has been battling since the eras of the Greeks and the Spartans, Athens and Sparta, as to how we actually self-govern ourselves. So there are two forms. There's hierarchical leadership, which is a pyramidal structure, which today manifests in the autocracies of the world, like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And then there's the democratic version, which came from the sea power roots, where a few people were self-responsible, and this whole idea that we take responsibility and we have a vote and we're part of a society, and which we think ultimately for smaller populations is more efficient. For larger populations, so far, hierarchy seems to dominate. And we've been in this struggle for literally thousands of years as to which system dominates over the other. And the West sea power has meant that it's fundamentally more lateralized and democratic. The land powers of the autocracies we now face are the opposite. And we've seen the struggle play out with Napoleon, who was believed to be far more dictatorial than the monarchs around him. We see it was played out because the Kaiser was more dictatorial and hierarchical than the other countries of Europe. Hitler was the second version of it. We've seen it because communism had manifested on the land powers of Russia with hierarchy in China too. And we're seeing it today in our world. So you've got these empire cycles of which the West is in terminal decline, and China is now trying to make its challenge. It's been held up by a glass ceiling with America since 75 because of American power, so it's late. And that late challenge means either goes or fails, and she is aware of that. And then you've also got this backdrop of autocracy versus democracy coming at a time when our values of democracy are weaker than ever because we've forgotten what a gift it is to have freedom. And we have completely failed to protect ourselves in the hubristic, self-absorbed dynamic of our modern culture, which is highly typical of decline. Because in expansion, people serve the system that rises. In contraction, they serve themselves first. And all of the Me Too movements, all of the LGBT concepts, they're all about self over collective, which has basically eroded our ability to see the threats, which are much bigger than any of the differences we have within our societies.
Okay, amazing. A few threads I want to pull on immediately. The first of which is when you explained your 5 cycles of empire: regionalization, empire expansion, maturation, overextension, and then decline. And then you walk through effectively, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the British, and now the American empire of examples of Western Christian empires that have followed this trend. What gives you the confidence that the American empire is the final chapter in the Christian Western empires? Is it as simple as there's nobody really to pick up the torch? If you look at Western powers, what country is in a position to take over or to raise their hand? And I mean, why do you have confidence that this is the conclusion of the Western Christian empires? And is it as simple as just looking at the balance sheets of Western powers? Is it as simple as looking at the emerging nations in the East? Or what do you pay attention to?
So look, cycles of coherence and lack of coherence are how our human system operates. When I talk about the end of the Western Christian world, it means it's got to be reinvented if it's going to recycle. And the form that we are not at the moment, and only some kind of hardship or really extreme hardship like a hegemonic conflict has the energy to reform ourselves, because no single power ever relinquishes control, even though they're linear, disastrous, and their policies obviously don't work. They hold on until the last moment. So power is ripped from them. So sadly, we're not conscious enough for people to step aside Mr. Biden and say your policies are disastrous, or step aside the Conservative Party and say you've betrayed all values of productivity that you once stood for as a Conservative Party. They just hang on until they're basically removed. And the systems are too weak and the power's too enfranchised. And so it's always an external force in history that comes along. In this case, it's called time by the challenge of China and its autocratic allies. Now, do I believe that the future of mankind is to be held under the fist of the CCP's autocratic control? No. I do not believe that the potential for humanity is best exerted through autocratic control. But at the moment, I am truly shocked at having seen a war coming for 20 years and tried to warn about it. I thought we'd have our defenses up, our elbows out, would be in some form of, like Cold War detente pushing back. In fact, we've been infiltrated, we've been weak, we've done everything wrong. America's 5-0 down in its conflict score, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya in a bit, to what's going on in Israel, to the Red Sea, and to Ukraine. It's terrifying because aggressors, and in this case, the autocracies, basically look at weakness as an opportunity. And we've done everything that makes us weaker. So we are going to have a terrible shock. And the best way I can describe it is the biggest level of collective delusion I've ever seen that I can find. Now, there's two reasons why this is happening, in my opinion. One is, after Pax Britannia, everyone was shocked at the outbreak of 1914. And very interestingly, many people said the world was too economically independent to go to war with each other. Wrong. But there was real shock when it happened. And because all the wars since the end of the Napoleonic War with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 basically had been regional conflicts. Even America's Civil War was a regional conflict that didn't dictate the old world's stability. But 1914 changed that. So there's a denial because of Pax Britannia, and there's a denial because of Pax America, first thing. The second is actually a massive own goal, in that America's response, like all empires before, has been to print money to compensate for lack of productivity. So if you think of real unleveraged productivity in 2000 being like 4%, let's just imagine this story. And by 2008, it's 2%. They just double the leverage and they get themselves up to what looks like 4% apparent. Here we are 40 times leverage, so you can assume that real American growth is 0.1%. That is a very, very scary concept. And it's that high because of the success of money printing and the sophistication of the way money printing has been operated by the Fed and other Western governments. But what that means is a perpetuation of non-productive behavior, non-adaptive behavior, and it means linear leadership can hold on for longer and longer and exclude the people that most can see the threat and respond to the threat. So we've got denial in that's the second form of denial, leadership that's too linear. But there's a third form of denial, which is fascinating. The printing of money has created the aeration of assets in America, especially, which are just a bubble of nth degree. But those bubbles produce dopamine within the collective market space. And dopamine shuts off the cortisol response of looking for threats. So for those three reasons, I think the Western world is about as deluded about the reality and the threats it faces any society in history. And it's a very dangerous condition.
Now, at the jump of this conversation, I spoke about the Battle of Africa. And I'm paying a lot more attention to this because, namely, it's not getting much media coverage. And I feel that it should be. As I mentioned, there's been 9 military coups in just the last 3 years, overthrowing governments. The most interesting part about this is that the majority of these military coups have had public support. And at present, and I don't know how you interpret poll numbers, but the majority of young Africans, as in under the age of 35, support military intervention in politics today. And so their faith in democracy is another way of interpreting this. Their faith in democracy is pretty diminished. Now, why am I paying attention to that? Because I think at the heart of most conflicts is a demand for resources. That's what we fight over, whether it was the banana wars in Central America, the turn of the 18th century, or wars over oil, whatever. I mean, this is usually what's at the core of it is we want your stuff, right? Okay. So, what is Africa? It's a massive exporter of energy and food, right? And that breaks down to petroleum products, uranium. Nigeria is one of the world's largest uranium exporters, livestock, produce, agricultural products, fertilizers, etc. So you're talking about the 2 necessities in life, energy and food. And that's what's at stake on the continent of Africa. Now, I look at these military coups and have to ask the question, who's funding this? Are these just local uprisings? I got to believe they aren't. The coincidence of 9 successful coups and at least 4 to 6 failed ones just tells me there's somebody behind the scenes pulling the strings, obviously. What's your take on that, David? What's going on the continent?
So I took and built, along with other partners, one of the biggest agricultural agglomerates in Africa. And we started in 0405, and we took in Western endowments. And one of the arguments I said to investors was the reason we need to do it is, A, it's a profitable construct, and the commodity cycle is, obviously going upwards, which it certainly did and was. But secondly, we had to go and displace any potential for Chinese investment in Africa because they would see Africa as the resource basin to feed their expansion. And this was way more than investment. This was strategic, participation in a rising system that basically needed to be fed, and in return, its resources could be exported to our economies. Now, I used to say that literally they used to smirk, and yet that's exactly what has happened since that time. Now, the difficulty is that America was never really a major player in Africa. It was really a British process and a French process. And Britain's foreign policy has just become ridiculously weak, apart from some areas of the Commonwealth. But most recently, both the Russians and the Chinese have truly accelerated their foot on the pedal. And I think it comes down to a number of things. And I think the example you missed, which is the most concerning of all, is there on the south of Africa is South Africa. South Africa that has fought side by side as a colony and then a member of the Commonwealth and a separate country with Britain. It's now been ruled by the ANC that is firmly in the camp of autocracy. That's a revolution that we need to wake up to. And essentially, they now exercise their navy with the Russians and Chinese. There are now regular flights in and out with ammunition flowing to Russia, which is from their stocks. And they are the first to go and criticize Israel at the Human Rights Court in The Hague. So all of a sudden, in front of our eyes, the ANC has revealed its true colors. Its colors came because it ran out of money, and they needed money, and money's what they're really getting to hold themselves up in their last vestiges of a very inefficient government that's raped a country that was really first world. But for the West, this should be really the biggest alarm bell of all. The Red Sea is now closed to shipping, and America's maritime naval hegemony dominance has been severely challenged by the fact it can't keep the sea route open. It's the biggest setback of all the setbacks since Afghanistan by a factor of 10. And that shipping is now going round the Cape of Good Hope. Now, what's really important is that, and people forget this, apartheid was allowed to continue to the end of the Cold War because the West needed to secure that trade route against communist infiltration. That trade route is now active again, and ships are now passing round the tip of Africa, and the tip of Africa is now in the other camp. So of all the things happening in Africa, that is by far the biggest piece and concerning piece strategically for the West. But there's also huge numbers, as you quite rightly say, of coups. You've got to assume they're funded by the Chinese and the Russians. That's the first place to go for, anti-Western. And at the same time, there are an increasing number of armed groups operating in Africa, which when in certain stages would create absolute havoc. And look at Nigeria, the problems it's having. It's huge. But Nigeria isn't alone. These armed groups are all over the place. There are jihadis that are trained in the Cape Flats in South Africa, which is just shocking. So I think that in the scenario which we'll talk about, which is a fully blown World War III, the Chinese can't reach Africa, but they've made it deniable in terms of their agencies and organizations that they funded, that we can't get to it either. And we're going to have to, if we fight for it, it'll take us a lot longer than a few months to quell. So I think their strategy is to create deniability in the phase when they lock themselves down inside the second island chain, can't get their navy beyond the dominance of the US Navy to Africa, but they can deny it to us. So I think that's something the West really needs to get its head around, because we're missing a major trick.
Now, you mentioned the concept of World War III. We've spoken about this before at a private event. At that event, I spoke to former NATO Commander General Wesley Clark. I asked him pointedly, are we in World War III? And he said, if you ask the West and its allies, no, we're not. But if you ask our adversaries, we've been in World War III for a few years already. What's your take at this point, David?
Yes, our adversaries are linked, and let's be very clear. The main adversary is China. It is the hub at the center of this wheel, and the spokes at the end have Russia and North Korea and Iran. But none of the spokes at the end would respond unless the hub had been planning, and it has been planning for 20 years to go to war with the West. The evidence is very clear. And basically, she has managed to pull all the strings that two of those three spokes are engaged with us. Iran via the Houthis and via Hamas and Hezbollah. Obviously, directly where Russia is fighting Ukraine, which is really not a proxy conflict. It's basically NATO versus Russia with a thin paper tissue veil between the two. So the idea that we leave them unfunded is just a test to the degree of delusion that people have that that's going to be okay. And what's amazing, it isn't billions and trillions of dollars. It's basically a small amount compared to European or US GDP that would put the Russians back or hold them at bay. Yet somehow the Magda Republicans under Trump, who has an unnatural affiliation to Putin, has sabotaged the whole process. And we have betrayed the Ukrainians totally in a way that actually will come back and haunt us in ways that many of us couldn't contemplate, because the war's coming to us. You either stop it outside our borders, and you certainly try and stop it at your walls. But what we're seeing is the militarization of Russia. And as the West deploys its weapons, the Chinese are able to learn about those weapons and adapt, making them more combat effective. And they can use their industrial process to replicate those lessons far faster than we can. So we are in an erosional process, and all we're waiting for now is when the Chinese choose to move. And the move will not be just over Taiwan. So yes, ever since 2022, I would say we are clearly in World War II, not even a proxy conflict. And it amazes me that everyone just seems to pretend it's okay. It's like Vietnam or Korea. It's a completely different magnitude event.
Could you explain a concept for me? So when you say the Americans have betrayed Ukraine, what is it that they betrayed? Okay,
so when the Cold War ended, America and Britain guaranteed Ukraine security when they gave up their nuclear weapons.
That's
guaranteed
right.
Their security means if someone invades you, you step up and you give them what they need to push them back. So in the failure to stop the funding process, that is betrayal. And America, the European powers haven't done enough, but Britain has done more than it could do. I think it's been extremely active. So I think it's got many other problems, but that's not one of them. But America's blocking of the funding is betrayal. America betrayed the Afghanistani people who backed the support and were left isolated, now are starving, and people. That's two betrayals in a row. And what America fails to understand, and this is really hard. I love America. I work for American institutions. I was brought up in America, so I really got to say this as someone that's very familiar. I have American friends, and I adore the concept of America. But America is a very, very interesting empire, because most Americans don't realize it is an empire. They don't realize that the military control that is exerted allows dollar extraction of worth, which allowed them to make their economy work. And so they don't see it as a loss when the boundaries contract. But believe me, it is. And the dollar will show it, as basically the system will show it. And the difficulty is that America also has built its power on alliances. And alliances are based on trust. So how does America persuade anyone that it can be trusted at a time of need? And you can see in Europe that they're terrified of Trump's arrival. They're actually finally waking up because they may well be on their own, which doesn't actually suit American strategic interests, because all the time the dollarized envelope that supports the system is contracting. And trust is a core part of an alliance. So, yes, I use the word very clearly. And I don't think it just started with Trump's MAGA Republicans. I think it actually, Biden did that too, because he was so terrified of Putin's nuclear threats, which, by the way, were designed to constrain the West's behavior with fear, that he was like Pavlov's dogs. And the result was every single piece of conventional support that flowed into Ukraine came late and in fewer numbers. And Biden basically came up with the concept of the bloody stalemate, which was not enough equipment to win, but not just enough equipment to hold on, hoping to just ablate the Russians. And it's been disastrous. So the betrayal is on both sides of the aisle.
Okay. And I do remember that at the conclusion of the Cold War, there was a deal struck. I didn't know it was a guarantee, but yes, that Ukraine would sell or relinquish their nuclear arms to the United States in exchange for the promise of security against a Russian invasion. Fast forward 30, 40 years, that invasion's occurring. So that's the betrayal. Okay, I'm with you there. I understand what you're saying. The Europeans are terrified of Trump winning the election. You just shared that. And, he's allegedly leaked to Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, that very soon, if he's back in office, he'll withdraw from Ukraine. Maybe that's part of the fear. He's also promised to restart the trade war with China on day one. A few of my recent guests have claimed that the 2024 election in America will be the biggest geopolitical event of the year. Do you see it that way? Or because the other take, and largely what I've seen more frequently in geopolitical circles, is that the president actually has far less influence and power than we give them credit for. And the playbook's already rolled out. They have far fewer choices than we understand. And who's in the seat doesn't matter so much. But is it different? What's your take?
Well, I'll make first, the observation is one of the clear evidences of decline is the lack of dynamic leadership potential. You've got two men, somewhere around 80, one that's clearly demented, and the other, which, dare I say it, his agenda is not about the well-being of America, but the agenda about himself. So the sense of service to collective, which all leadership should exhibit, is not existent. And from my experience, if there's one thing I've learned, is when engaging with narcissists, however perceived valuable they are, however talented they are, it always ends up badly because they come first over everyone else. And I think we've perhaps culturally got to realize we had one in the form of Boris Johnson, and narcissism didn't work for us. It doesn't work for any country. So the choices in front of America are deeply troubling. But what I'm more concerned about before the election is I think the evidence that China has got itself into a 4-year plan like the Nazis did from 36 to 40, which is essentially war or go bust, that they put themselves into that position. And that will play out before the election. And if you think about it, there's some rationale around it. If you forget, there are lots of reasons why I'm concerned it's a now. One is the arrival of the hegemonic weapon systems, which are anti-ship ballistic missiles. Now, when they came in 2018, I was probably a sole voice saying, wake up, everyone. That's a weapon of hegemonic challenge. Because all hegemonies face a hegemon that has had an established large length of money and resource to put in to a weapon system and weapon process, which gives it dominance. So the challenging hegemony has to come up with an asymmetric solution, which basically unravels that advantage. So if you came up with carriers when you were Britain with a battleship navy, well, that's a good example of, or submarines, as the Germans did. But in this case, they came up with ship-killing ballistic missiles, which could kill carriers. They were designed to unravel American hegemony, yet no one noticed. No one did the counters. No one realized they were real. And now we face thousands of these systems sitting on the mainland to swamp the Japanese and American Navy in a space of 2 hours with no warning. But she probably had a little bit of an issue with, does the system work if I use it? And what we're seeing in the Red Sea is a trial run, just as we saw the Condor legions fight in the Spanish Civil War and basically create the concepts of blitzkrieg, which then were built upon in 1940 for the invasion of Western Europe and Poland. The same process. Right now, we know that anti-ship ballistic missiles, even though they're very crude, via Iran with probably some components from China, are shutting down essentially the waterways because only 50% of American destroyers can intercept ballistic missiles. So that's the first thing. China's in a go, no go with its weapon system, and lasers with 300 kilowatts, basically, when they come online, might counter that in a year's time. So there's a weapons window. There's a window because Biden is the weakest president in terms of his action you could ever hope for. Would you prefer to face Trump because he's unpredictable, or would you prefer to trace Biden? It'll be Biden every time. There's a financial condition, which basically is rather dire because they've collapsed the social camouflage of markets, which were used to seduce Western investors to come to China and build them out. They don't need them anymore. So right now we're sitting on the cusp, and watching gold move is one of my really big alarm bells, because gold isn't moving because the dollar's going down. Gold is moving as a safe haven before anything else. And so is Bitcoin. When behavior like this happens, you really have to take it very seriously of the imminence of the threat.
So Janet Yellen is on her way to China to scold President Xi for flooding the international market with cheap goods. I'm not sure what effect that's going to have. Simultaneously, Biden has now been threatening to restart some of the Trump tariffs. I hear this headline, I see this activity, and I maybe make the assumption that they're just looking at American poll numbers. Biden is getting crushed. And a lot of what Trump is saying is that I'm going to restart the trade war and get tough with China. So Biden's camp is saying we need to pretend we're going to do that too, or at least tell the public we're going to do that too, right? To make up the lost ground in the polls. How do you interpret it? Is the Biden administration?
I think you're spot on. Basically, It's like a 4-foot midget going up to a 6-foot healthy giant and saying, please, would you stop that?
Right.
It's not going to happen. The Chinese are the most sophisticated planners right now in the world. Everything you see now has been planned 20 years ago. They have run rings around us. They've they've infiltrated our societies at political level. They've infiltrated our academia. They've infiltrated magazines that write articles that change our thought. They've got through our social media. They've created basically a process where they control their whole population through social credits and AI. This is like nothing we've ever seen. And we bimble around as if we're superior. No, we're on the back foot. And one of the reasons why we haven't rung the alarm bell is because of the level of this sleepiness to do with markets I've talked about, and hegemonic gaps, and Pax America ending, but people not realizing it, and B, the level of external manipulation taking place. And for example, external manipulation isn't just Chinese, it's Russian. And if you look at this latest piece, you probably heard about Hanover syndrome, which is a targeted process by the Russians to hit serious US politicians, diplomats, agents, and knock them out. Now, they've been doing that for a year or 10 years. That is incredibly aggressive. They've been stripping our IP. None of this is a relationship which is benign. And all of these dynamics, especially with the drumbeat of this commodity cycle that still is 6 years from its peak, it's all going to get worse. And it's going to get much worse because the only way to solve it is a kinetic strike for the Chinese.
So when you say the Chinese have been planning this for 20 years, they've, as a consequence, been one step ahead of us, it's hard to see it working out any other direction when we live in a world that changes leadership every 2 to 4 years. And there's obvious advantages to democracy, and I'm pro-democracy. It's a self-correcting system and probably the best of a whole bunch of terrible political systems. But, when I
agree with that.
So but there's disadvantages to this. Now, I think about my business, for example. If I'm trying to plan my business quarter after quarter, I'm constantly going to be outsmarted, be outmaneuvered, and be caught flat-footed. So I plan my business 3 to 5 years out, and then I try to be adaptable because I'm a small business, right? When I think about a company like Amazon, I saw an interview with Jeff Bezos, and the interviewer, the host, was asking him about a down quarter he was having. And he looked at the host as if, she had rocks in her head. And he said, "Do you think I'm surprised by this quarter?" He's like, "I knew we were going to have a down quarter 3 years ago. Like, do you actually think I'm thinking this near term, right? This is Amazon." And you're like, of course, he's not thinking quarter by quarter. He's thinking 5, 10 years. And of course, he knew he would have a down quarter 3 years ago. But that's the advantage of thinking long term. We can't really do that, or we can't action our long-term plans. We've got tons of politicians that make long-term promises, but they're never around to fulfill them. Right.
Well, okay, so let's roll back. Let's take America post the Second World War. It had dominated successfully and brought to conclusion this huge conflict. It was the height of its power. And if it was now facing this autocratic challenge, it would more than be a match for it. The quality of the leadership, the quality of the vision, the strategic thinking would have matched it without doubt. And there wouldn't be an ingress. We know so because it faced down the communist threat. The problem is not democracy. The problem is the maturity of democracy has created this ingrained lateral linearization, and linear people can't see beyond the rim of their glasses, yet alone the fact there's a large freight car coming to one side of them, which is so obvious. So I don't think it's the problem of democracy. It's the problem of the cycle of democracy we're in. And there is a solution to it, and that is to lateralize. War naturally forces lateralization. And I speak to, I've done 2 years in a row of lecturing senior generals and admirals and members from foreign about warfare and conflict. And one of the things I try and describe to them, peacetime military structures become linear and politicized. The moment they go to the war, the linear leadership dies and takes its men with it and women, and essentially only the lateral ones rise to the fore. And in that room were many Ukrainian senior officers. And I asked them, "Do you have many linear leaders left in your services right now?" And they all nodded. They don't. War lateralizes and linear thinking dies. So the point is, there's an artificial way to lateralize, and I've designed it, and I've used it on organizations.
And you did
essentially,
I need you to expand on that concept for me, David. Sorry to interrupt you. If you could just expand on the idea of lateralization for me. What exactly does that mean?
So I described to you in the cycle of empires that basically the rise is predominated by lateral adaptive thinking, and the decline is predominated by linear fixed thinking and the loss of productivity. And then it's swept away by another system or external events. So in my studies, my model for human social construct is 70% of society is linear. And of course, everyone's on a spectrum. So you can be more lateral but linear, or you can be more linear and lateral. And then the other 30% is lateral. The real sweet spot is lateralized linearization. So people that are lateral and linear are the real people you want, because they can see big picture, but they can see details. So encouraging people to develop linear skills who are lateral is one of the important things, and encouraging linear people to be more lateral and more open-minded is another. So you're moving the system forward. But initially, what you've got to do is put all your strategic thinking, planning, and leadership in an adaptive phase into the hands of lateral thinking, but all the execution mechanisms in the details and process into your linear thinkers. And you've got to value them both and realize that it isn't a competition, that you're mutually symbiotic and the two systems work really well together. But this idea, for example, if you look at Sunak and look at Biden, they're both examples of extreme linear thinking. Biden's thinking strategically, despite him thinking he's the greatest gift to foreign policy, is exactly the opposite. Everything he touches, he just eviscerates and falls to pieces. He has got a slug trail of disasters behind him. And Sunak is exactly the same. Same process. He cannot see beyond the railway tracks. Now, lateral people that I think are really good examples are Ronald Reagan. He was great because he had a vision, and he got other people to execute, the greatest president in modern times. And I think actually Margaret Thatcher was exactly the same. She was a lateral woman with linear skills that were brought about by her chemistry degree. So what we need to do is actually redefine who should be in charge of our country, our military, and our businesses. Because at the moment, they're in the control of the 99% of the wrong people that cannot see this calamity coming towards them, and therefore are least prepared in hundreds and hundreds of years of conflict.
Okay, I'm with you there. And so you could almost substitute the word adaptability with lateral. I mean, that's sort of the spirit of the idea. Yeah.
Yes.
Have the process, trust the process, be ready for change, be ready to be agile and adaptable if you
Yeah,
need
and
to.
also it's the idea, actually, it's very interesting. If you look at Einstein, who was a good example of a lateral linear thinker, all his great ideas were laterally intuitive, but then he could justify them with a linear process. That's the optimum mechanism. But it's very hard to actually get linear people because our educational system is a linear system. So the lateral people survive through the educational system and have to become a linear and adaptive, but they're lateral fundamentally. What we don't have is a system that takes linear people and lateralizes them.
No.
But we've got to do that.
Yes.
And we've got to encourage it because then the body of democracy is better suited to make better judgments about who leads them.
There's some of the things that we've talked about today. I see these negative trends correcting course, and I don't know if they'll correct course enough to make a difference. But you talked about how our school system forces children into a linear thinking model, and absolutely. And if you're not built that way, you rebel against it, right? And you have problem childs who aren't recognized for their true skill set; they're just sort of vilified for not following the rules. I have 3 young kids. This is a constant conversation with young parents right now. And a big trend is parents like us pulling their kids out of the traditional school system and building education systems almost a la carte, with maybe a tutor for math and science and lots of travel for culture and history and building the system ourselves, right? And my wife and I are trying to figure this out through a combination of a la carte options and living abroad travel and sort of piecing this together while our children are still super young. Because, I think about what are the skill sets? Like, I don't know what the world's going to look like in 5 years, let alone 10, 20, when they'll be in the job market. So how should I best arm them for the future? Well, it's like tenacity and creativity are probably the 2 best things, right? So they'll understand the relationship between hard work and reward, and they'll be creative problem solvers. And if you have those skills, then you're probably going to do okay. But that's not taught in the school system, and parents are recognizing that, and we're trying to deal with it. I'm seeing that.
Well, I think that's really great that you are. So there's a piece I've probably missed out. I would argue that 2/3 of the 30% that are lateral are predominantly dyslexic. And dyslexic is the human adaptive gene.
Interesting.
And it only really came to the fore because it was forced to spell 100 years ago and write, or some time back. But the truth is, it's a completely different process. And I'm dyslexic. And when someone says, why did you come up with these ideas? It's because patterns and connections are natural to the way I think. I then had to learn how to be more process driven in my physics so I can combine a lateral process with a linear process because of my education. But I watch many people not do that, and my children are all dyslexic. And the educational systems are, as you quite rightly say, more and more linear. Now, I was very lucky to find a school that actually had a lateral process.
Yes.
And they are surrounded by other lateral people. So they no longer question themselves and feel unsubstantiated. They're actually, as I said, very grounded, have peer groups who think in similar ways, and they're reinforced. Whereas my experience was it took me until I was 30 to really understand why I was responding and seeing the way I did and how different people responded to me, even though I didn't say a word. Because one of the things that's interesting is that lateral people are very threatening to linear people who want control and power.
Right.
Whereas lateral people tend to be much more open-minded and free-flowing. And the two are they need to learn to work together rather than actually elbow each other out and damage each other in the process.
Yeah.
But we have to recognize that humanity is bifurcated, in my opinion.
100%. 100%. The second trend that we talked about earlier was sort of this trend of individualism over the collective, which is powerful, right? If applied properly, or maybe at the right stage of the cycle. That's what built America was the right to freedom of expression and individuality and all of this, right?
But you're so right, because the difference between the values of building America were a sense of belonging to America and an individual in a collective and a sense of national pride and a sense of sacrifice to protect that national body. What we've got right now is individuality with no sense of service, no sense of loyalty, that basically puts self beyond all others. And in fact, one of the reasons that I think narcissism is becoming more prevalent in national leadership is because narcissism has become more prevalent within the society itself.
Yeah.
And the result is actually they can't identify it as being wrong because no one identifies themselves as being wrong.
I just picked up a book called Bad Therapy, and the author's been ridiculed tremendously for being critical of providing therapy to children. And, that's not the case. Her argument is not that all therapy is bad. Her argument is that we've gone way too far with presenting our children to therapists when it's absolutely not needed. And the consequence of that is that we're essentially encouraging children to talk about themselves exhaustively to strangers and overthink their feelings exhaustively to the point where, it's a very narcissistic activity to go see a therapist if you haven't been through something very traumatic in a way.
I'm not sure I agree with that, right? I think that one of the most incredible things about the path of democracy is facilitating the internal growth of each of us as human beings in our self-awareness. And self-awareness is only gained through reflection in our relationships with others. And when we're in relationships like girlfriend, boyfriend, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, in fact, it's quite hard to get an objective perspective as to, is it you or is it your partner? So really good therapists, really good ones, allow mirrors. And under that process, you're encouraging greater emotional articulation and awareness. But that should not be mixed with the tendency of I'm more important than anyone else. It needs to be within the context that you fit within a society, and you're trying to understand how you relate to that society for a positive construct. And I think so much of what you say is true in that it's gone off the reservation. The purpose has actually become self-feeding about self rather than self-knowledge and self-centeredness, and that balance between self and the collective we rely on and belong to.
Right. And I think, good therapists, 100%. And maybe the issue that she's pointing to is the proliferation of bad therapists in that, I was bullied pretty bad in school, but I don't think that was trauma. I think that was life, right? Like, it wasn't disastrous, and it wasn't, a lot of kids had it worse than me, but a therapist may encourage your life experience for you to recognize your life experience as trauma, when in reality, it's like sometimes life's just really hard and unfair. That's the reality, right?
And I had very similar experiences. I learned to fight my way through school. I learned that some people literally live by their fists. And if you want to speak out, you need to be able to protect yourself. Exactly. And the microcosm of that is democracy. If we want to have free speech, we need strong full spectrum deterrence. And the moment we stop, we lose our power to speak. And we've done that in the West.
So you hit on something that I wrote down earlier when you were speaking about, I just wrote, weakness invites aggression and strength discourages conflict, as you were talking about how the West is protecting themselves.
So true. And the way to think about this, which is quite difficult, is there's a whole portion of my theories about how individuals behave. But there is a group of 2% of humanity that I call human predators. And the problem is that in the normal section, we all naturally project who we are onto others. And, in the spectrum of normalness, it'll be pretty similar responses. But there's 2% are coded completely different. They're coded to camouflage themselves emotionally. They're coded to look like something like a Venus flytrap before they eat you. And then we are blinded by our projection onto them. So one of the things that society really needs to do, it's a big question. How do these dictators get to the top and then literally force millions of people into suffering? I would answer they are human predators that use camouflage to rise through the system, and people aren't astute enough to stop them before they get control. So if we're going to change history, we're going to change it in one part by being aware of how this works. And for the people in the normal band, identify what is a human predator and to get them early rather than when they suddenly unveil themselves and they're all powerful. Right. So someone like Putin is a human predator. Someone like Xi is a human predator. They do not think in any way. So when I talk about Putin's going to war, and I was able to warn he would invade 6 months beforehand, and everyone was saying, well, why would he do that? What's his advantage? I can't see the strategy. And said, you don't understand. He doesn't think like you. He doesn't see the world like you. And you've got to understand how he thinks to make an assessment, and you're not. And that's the same with Xi. It's the same with Trump. Same process. So it's one of the areas I really try and encourage is understand that there are human predators who prey on the rest of humanity.
Yeah, I think they're called politicians, David.
Increasingly so.
I mean, heaven forbid, what would occur if Justin Trudeau had access to one of the world's most powerful militaries? God.
Well, he'd probably hold his hands up and surrender to himself.
All right. So, the last, I love that we're getting into more esoteric topics. It's my favorite, to be honest. But, just to close the loop on the individualistic mentality, the individualism that we talked about, I'm also seeing a trend in sort of my age group of young parents who I think have recognized, as you put it, there's a lack. There's no sense of service. That's what you said. There's no sense of service in the population. And my age group parents are recognizing that, coupled with the idea that it takes a village to raise a child, and that village doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I live in a great neighborhood. I've got great neighbors, but if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, they're not stepping in. They're not, right? It's like, that's really too bad. They'll send some cards.
It's really too bad.
Yes. So I send a check every month to a faceless corporation to play that role in my village, right? I hire the insurance company to take care of my family in that worst case scenario. But, this lack of sense of service, I think, is driving, I'm seeing a massive return to Christianity as well in my age group of parents. And it's I get it. We're looking for that common purpose in life and that community, all the stuff that the church used to provide, and it doesn't exist in a secular culture. Are you seeing that trend, and what's your take?
Look, I'm not seeing it over here at all. But what I am seeing is, because Christianity's pulse is really ebbing, as it would do, I expect to, in the last of the Western Christian empires, and I expect it to be stronger in America than it is in Europe because it's further away from that link.
Right.
But what we are seeing is twofold. We're seeing Islamic belief systems power into the crack where Westerners don't believe in anything strongly enough, and therefore they can't displace and push back the challenge, which is why you see in Britain this really emphasization on a minority, which are very welcome to be in our country as long as they abide by our laws and our culture, but they are imposing their culture on us as a minority. And so that's part of that process. I think there's something else too, and that is that we have just had one of the richest, wealthiest periods in human history. We've had materialness, we've had just about everything we could want, and yet most people are completely miserable. Because the bottom line is materialism doesn't give us inner well-being and authenticity. Authenticity is something we work on to integrate the layers of our personality that allows us to access our happiness and our well-being. And it should be something that children are encouraged to do. Everyone is encouraged to do, whatever age, because without it, I believe everything else is just secondary.
Right.
I think we're also at the stage where this wealth and materialism will not be duplicated. And basically, we're going to end up with a very different construct where we're going to have to find our well-being with much less. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is at the peak of that cycle. And that's one of the reasons you're probably seeing what you're seeing in a very materialistic American society. And the other thing that you did touch on, there are no collective social values in the same way. And the church represents, and that's why Christianity in its liberal form has a set of family values and beliefs in the goodness of individuals and, all of those sort of non-self issues that transcend self into a collective. So I can see exactly, and I'm not surprised you said it, it's just further away from the epicenter over here than it is where you are. But it's our need to be something. And I think that we as human beings we are spiritual beings. We have the ability to learn to integrate ourselves in this decade and generation in ways that, we've never had. But we've also wasted that experience because we now face global conflict, which is going to call on us and our children to do things that we should never have allowed to happen. And we should live in shame. My generation should be absolutely in shame to have this legacy for the generations behind to go through. It's something I've tried to work on and educate. I dedicated myself when I started writing books as a dyslexic to warning this was coming. And, I'm absolutely appalled that I just haven't even dented the sides. In fact, it's gone far worse than I ever imagined in terms of society's degeneration. But we're now going to be tested as the Ukrainians have been tested.
You hit on another cycle that I pay a lot of attention to, which is, I guess it's how I process the cycle of empire. Not very similar to your 5 stages here, but productivity fuels wealth, wealth fuels decadence, decadence feels debt, and debt feels decline. And when I think about, those four stages and where we might land, and you could apply them to the Portuguese Empire, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, and the American, it's quite clear where we are.
What you've described is the hallmarks of the last two phases: overextension and decline.
Right.
But They don't define how you get there, in effect. But you're spot on about that cycle within decline, which is everything most people have experienced for the past 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, a values reset, although painful, would probably be very healthy as a standalone action. So, well, I want to pivot a little bit to. You mentioned you're seeing warning signs in the gold price and some early warning signals. Can you touch on what you're paying attention to in the commodities market and in trade? And getting back to this adage that I love: trade makes men wise, politics makes them dangerous. So stepping back from the political cycles, what are you seeing in the trade cycles, David?
So the overwhelming pattern that we are subject to globally is the Kondratiev cycle, which started in 2000 to 2002. And its first pulse in the A wave led to a peak in 2010, 2011. That's the A wave. The B wave, which was counter-inflationary and significantly so because underlying productivity in the West was really so low, ended with the process of the pandemic and the negative oil spike. We are now in the C wave, the most powerful of all the Kondratiev surges. And they're ultimately surged and fueled by commodity constriction. So the first surge peaked at the beginning of the Ukraine invasion. Everything we had down to the lows, 6 months ago, even a year ago, that was the correction. And we have been coiling for this massive move, and a move that ultimately will take oil to 250 somewhere before the peak in 2030, and even higher. It'll take gold to 10,000. It's like of an order that basically is difficult to comprehend. Constriction of resources through World War III, and at the same time, the fiat money that has been printed so liberally, desperately trying to get into two swimming pools of gold and silver and platinum. And one of the pieces which I did some extensive study on is how the markets behaved into World War I and World War II, and interposed where they were on the Kondratiev cycle. And I came up with very, very clear indications of what that would mean for us going forwards, which are playing out very accurately. One thing is interesting is that markets and equity markets have reacted before turning point battles in World War I and World War II. Before even the generals knew they were going to fight the battle, the market turned beforehand. Both at the Battle of Amiens 3 weeks beforehand in 1918 in August, both at the turning point before the Battle of Britain, and both at the turning point for America before the Battle of the Coral Sea, or just at it. So markets have some process. Now, some people would say they know something. In this case, no, they didn't, because there are no military records that each of those combat moments were going to be successful. In Midway, the Coral Sea, or basically the Battle of Britain. In fact, at the time it happened, they looked like they were going to be the opposite. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. Start thinking about markets as not something that have cause and effect, but as some quantum mechanical change agent that somehow understands before it's played out, is the best way to describe it. And if you don't understand quantum mechanics and what it means for markets, I suggest you come to my site and you sign up and you start to learn basically how these more complex ideas really do work in our real world. But in terms of gold is moving anomalously, and Bitcoin started to say as well. Both of these safe haven areas are moving when nothing else is moving. This is a big alarm bell, because it is as if they're moving before anything else as the constriction comes. And as this commodity surge goes and oil goes through 100 and 110, which I think it's inevitably going to do, believe me, conflict will be coincident with that of a scale of a world war with the Chinese involved. And it looks to me like we're in the movement of that. So I think I would take this move as not just an anomaly, but a warning that something much bigger is happening. And you could argue the Chinese are stockpiling gold, which is very clear, and that itself will do it. But then you have to ask the question, why does the country stockpile gold?
Well, that's a great question. And China, world's largest producer of gold, they export none. They're also a massive importer of gold. So, it's a curious question how much they might own. But central banks in general have been setting records in gold acquisition for like a couple of years now, like 40, 50-year records. What's your take? I look at this and say, well, gold's a lifeboat. It's where you divest into if you don't know what's around the corner, right? Because there's no counterparty risk. It's got a couple thousand-year cycles of history, and if you don't know what's next, if you don't know what to expect, you want to jump onto the lifeboat that doesn't have that counterparty risk.
So look, let's be more specific. If you don't know what to expect, you shouldn't do anything. But if you do expect some escalation in conflict dynamics, gold is the best thing you can own until your government takes it off you, which one day they will, by the way, because they'll use it to fund themselves. But up until that moment, essentially, it's the great place to be. Do I want to be part of the bond market? No, I don't. I mean, literally, neither side, earlier we talked about US politicians, neither side are going to curtail spending in the States. And the interest budget's going through the roof. And America is close to some kind of economic collapse. We're like all empires, when you do this and you print this much money, you can't do it. And time is called. And time is called when inflation hits. And commodity constriction brings input inflation. So you do not want to hold bonds because they're a disaster area just about to unfold. That means equities won't last either. And you don't want to own the dollar because the dollar, like all hegemonic systems under challenge, won't do very well. And so what are you left with? Base resources and commodities, energy, copper, core things. Even lithium, I called the low on lithium when it made recently in the last weeks. But gold and silver are probably the front runners in that, because not only do they have a commodity dynamic, they have an inflation hedge dynamic, and they have a store of value dynamic. And once in a while, they really work. And this is the once in a while.
And I think it may be region specific where you might go. I know Nigeria, which we spoke about earlier, is in a ton of trouble. The population's, I wouldn't say fleeing to Bitcoin, but that's the asset that they have access to. If you have a cell phone, you can buy Bitcoin. Buying physical gold's a lot harder for a lot of people, right? In the West, maybe we'll see more gold acquisition. What do you think?
Yeah, well, look, one of the interesting things is Bitcoin has moved differently from many of the other smaller cryptos because it's a safe haven play in scale. And gold and silver will be the activator once gold starts to move up. And one of the huge areas is actually the gold and silver miners, which are vastly underrated, especially silver miners. Huge optionality on that right now. Yeah. But what I would encourage people to do is stop thinking that this is a peacetime paradigm. Stop thinking that money printing creates the same escalation in asset value, and start thinking what happens in a wartime economy. And a lot of my work explains to my clients and investors essentially how to manage that. And no one has experience of basically the interruption because they haven't really thought it's a viable option. But it's going to be exactly as it was in World War I and World War II, in a combination of events that people are not aware of.
Well, if people want to check your work out, davidmurrin.co.uk is where I'll send them. I really appreciate your time today and allowing me to pick your brain on such an eclectic collection of topics. Super fun chatting with you today, David.
Well, it's been super fun with you. And there's one of the things that I really cottoned onto that it's worth articulating. And that is what I try to do in my work is I try to help linear thinkers be more open-minded about lateral options. But one thing I didn't expect was to have a huge number of lateral followers who disappeared down every rabbit hole they could find. And what I try and say to them is you need to add linear processing to work out which rabbit hole is real or not. Otherwise, you waste your efforts. And so in my work, I try and help both sides of the thought process to optimize the use of their energy to understand the world. And I couldn't articulate even that in that way 6 months ago. I finally sort of worked something out that is my lateral followers weren't using their linear process and the linear followers weren't even looking. And that somewhere in terms of shifting and changing the outcomes, it's about helping both sides.
Isn't it funny how we just love going all in on things like that? If you abandon linear thinking and understand there's a demand for lateral, then you just go all in on lateral and fall down every rabbit hole available to you.
It is. Well, you see, I think actually I call it the exile of the laterals. It's a really interesting phenomena. And that is, that lateral people, as this adaptive agency, are used to having missions in life and doing great things. So corporals, sergeants in war, they are people that maybe were poorly educated, but examples of lateral at the low level. And at the higher level, people seek to fix problems and change things. But this linear construct of this world of money printing forever has meant that the laterals are so exiled, they don't really know who they are. They never had to explain to them. Their identity and their value disappears. All sorts of problems come with being exiled when you're meant to have a social purpose. And the net result is no one said, look, actually, this is what you were designed to do. Now you need to have these disciplines to stay on track. Otherwise, the linear camp will say, I told you, he's a Looney Tune. He disappeared down every rabbit hole and 3 of them are rubbish. It's about, if you want to stay relevant, you've got to do as you say, which is combine the two systems. All of us need to get towards that middle ground.
Those rabbit holes are so seductive, though.
And I talk about some, and there are some which I will expound because they do have linear process behind. But one of the ones I always laugh at is the story of Davos Man, and I say, have you met Mr. Davos? He couldn't organize a piss up in a brewery, and if he was smart and if he saw as much, he would have realized the Chinese are coming to eat him and done something about it, but they haven't.
Interesting. I like that one. Okay. Look, David, thank you for joining me on the show. I really appreciate your time. And again, davidmurrin.co.uk. Check out all of his material. Great investment of your time. Thanks so much, David.
Jay, thank you very much.
Commodity investing for beginners. No complex strategies, just actionable information. Our comprehensive course breaks down the complexities so you can make informed decisions and gain financial freedom.